makes those cups like that. That's kind of like we have at work.
Yeah.
And he always wants 16 ounces. But I don't know, he gets 2 8s. Stephanie tried to explain this to him one day, actually like Friday. And he'll pour a little bit of it out because it won't all fit in there. That's not a 16.
Maria. Maria. Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
That was 4 of you. Let's try again. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
There we go. Now, I'm going to clip this, Amanda. But if I go to switch over to it, I'll let you know because it's not on right now.
Okay. Well, because I'm trying to get audio on one of them.
It should already be ready to go.
Yeah, audio. Oh, there it is. I found it.
Okay. Now, we're going to be in Matthew 18 this morning. We've been doing a series I've entitled Finding Fruit in the Fables of Faith. A fable is a made-up story. And a lot of times when Jesus wants to teach us something, he does it through a story. Because that's the best way we learn. You could have a teacher stand in front of you and give you the facts and give you the dates and give you the information. And if anybody remembers their school days, what we do is we learn all that stuff for the test. And as soon as the test is over, it pops right back out of our heads.
Yeah.
Right? So that is the way some teachers teach. It's not the best way to teach. The best way to teach is the way that Jesus liked to do it, which is through stories or using an analogy, showing you something. The kingdom of heaven is likened to an ear of corn, and get you to relate that to something. We remember that better, right? If I stand up in front of you, I used to have a Bible college professor that was really annoyed when he used to be a pastor, and he would have the hardest time getting his congregation to get onto his level. Now, I think he was a very humble man, so he didn't realize his level was way up here, right? And he's like, why don't you understand this? And his people are like, we are trying, right? But I just got through, an 8-hour shift of fixing people's plumbing problems and, whatever else jobs they did. And he's like getting frustrated, but he found out that when he would say, okay, well, this Bible lesson, the Bible's like a pizza. Right? And then these toppings are this, and these toppings are that, and this is the cheese, and this is the sauce. People learn better. He didn't like to have to do that, but that's the way we learn. Mm-hmm. Right? If what is more interesting, in your opinion? A documentary or an actual budgeted movie? The movie, right? If you go out and see a movie, you go to the theater, it's got the big screen, there's the speakers, assuming maybe let's pretend like you've got the whole theater to yourself, right? Because let's be honest, the reason people don't like to go to the movie theaters is because of the other people.
Right.
So if you had a whole theater just to you and yours, you'd be like, man, I do that every time. Or you could go home and watch a documentary about snails.
That sounds fun.
Right. Sarcasm. And it's true. It wouldn't be very interesting because a documentary is more about facts and information. A movie might teach you a lesson, but it does it through a well-written story.
Right.
So in Matthew 18 this morning, we see another of these really well-written stories. Now, Jesus kind of goes through and he's talking about several things. He's talking about having the faith of a child. He gives some stories that we're going to double back on in other lessons. But he comes to Peter, asks him a question. Now, this is a really good question. Peter asks him this question, and it's probably a question that we have asked ourselves a lot of times. So in verse 21, Peter says, Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? That's a good question. That's a question we've often asked ourselves. How many times is somebody supposed to be allowed to stab you in the back and you forgive him? Right? How many times are you supposed to be betrayed by somebody or hurt by somebody and you continue to forgive them? Now, we're using the word forgive this morning. That's super important because to forgive somebody is a very, very different thing than to trust somebody.
Right.
We understand this. To forgive somebody is also different than to harbor bitterness against somebody. And I'm going to explain that to you here in just a second, because to forgive somebody being different than to trust somebody is a matter of relationship between you and that person. Somebody may do something against me and I forgive them for it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to trust them for that same thing the next time. Right? It means that maybe they're not the kind of person that can hold up their end of the bargain, or maybe they're tempted to do something for themselves even though it hurts the other people. Right? If they struggle with that temptation, it wouldn't be smart for me to put myself in a position to get hurt by them again. So I can forgive them and still be cautious about trusting them about that thing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Also, difference between forgiveness and harboring bitterness is a matter of between you and that person. You see, when you let go of bitterness, that's for you. Yeah. That's for you, and that's for the Lord. Forgiveness is something that has to be asked for. Okay, let me say that. If somebody comes to you and says, man, I know I messed up, I'm sorry, please forgive me, then you forgive them. All right, that's what forgiveness is. Because the temptation is still to say, you know, man, I'm pretty upset. It may take me a while to figure out how to forgive you. Right? And that's not the attitude we should have. But forgiveness is something that is asked for. Somebody asks you forgiveness. They tell you they're sorry, and then you have to forgive them. You'd say, well, Pastor, I'm not so sure about that. Well, think about this. How does it work with us and God? Right? God is a perfect example. You couldn't say God is mistakenly dealing with forgiveness because he's God.
Right.
So, how does it work for when God forgives us? We go and we ask for it. We get saved. We ask for forgiveness for our sins, don't we? And the instant we ask for it, he forgives us. Right? Now, that doesn't mean he's harboring hatred and ill will toward us before that. He has let go of any bitterness he might have toward us. But he can't forgive us until we ask to be forgiven. You see how that works? And if that's how it works with God, that's how it works with us. So Peter comes to Jesus and he's asking this thing about forgiveness. How many times is he supposed to do the same thing to me over and over and over again, and I continue to forgive him? Let's imagine I had a friend. Let's call him Ted. I've never known a person in real life whose name is Ted, so nobody should be offended by this. Let's say that Ted comes over to the house ever so often, and he hangs out, and maybe we're playing cards, or maybe we're just, watching a football game or something, and the night goes on, and he goes home, and I notice when I go to check my wallet sitting on the counter that I've got a $20 bill missing out of my wallet. And then I ask him about it, and he says, yeah, you know what, I'm so sorry, I've got I do this terrible thing, I'm seeing a doctor about it, but I'm a bit of a, what is it called? I've got some kleptomania, and I'm so sorry that I did that, please forgive me. And I say, you know what, fine, I'll forgive you. And he comes back over next week, and we're hanging out, and the same thing happened. I notice a $10 bill's missing. How many times in a row am I supposed to forgive Ted before I finally say, you know what, Ted, no, you're not coming over anymore? Now, maybe I stop keeping the wallet around, right? But how many times before I say, you know what, Ted, me and you are done. I don't need this in my life. Go away. That's Peter's question. He says, till 7 times. Now that might seem like, well, of course that's not the answer. But think about that in real life. If somebody did to you something like that 7 times, stole from you 7 times, or they cheated you out of an opportunity at work 7 times in a row, that's a lot. If somebody were to do something that cost you something big or something important, and they did that 7 times in a row, that's a lot of times to be forgiving somebody. I think 90% of the world, if I had to guess, would not last 7 times. Jesus saith unto him in verse 22, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 7 times 70. Or until 70 times 7. So he's doing a bit of wordplay here. If you notice, Because Peter said 7 times. So he's taking the word times and he's using the double meaning of times to mean how many moments am I supposed to do this, to also the multiplication word times. 70 times 7. So a bit of a word play here Jesus is doing, but it's not an actual mathematical algorithm for forgiveness. Jesus is not giving you the math formula for forgiveness. Okay, that's not what that is. Not quite so literal as all that. What he's saying is there is no limit. There is no point at which you stop giving people your presence in their life. There is no point at which you stop forgiving somebody. We continue to forgive. And he's explaining this to Peter, and Peter's still not fully getting it, right? So he does what Jesus does best. He puts it in a story. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a certain king, which would take account of his servants. Now, these are servants. These aren't slaves. There's a very big difference. These people get paid for what they do. And it's a job they choose and so forth. That's going to be an important distinction because of what happens later in the story. Verse 24, he said, when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. Now, a talent is worth a little bit of money. And 10,000 talents was a whole lot of money. I'm not exactly sure how that would equate to the dollar today, but I think in their economy as opposed to our economy, it would be a bit like us owing around $1 million. It's a large chunk of change. But for as much as he had not to pay, he couldn't pay this huge debt that he owed his master. His Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children and all that he had in payment to be made. So this, you might think, wow, that's kind of harsh. It is kind of harsh, but it also is fair. Because when you talk about selling a person, you drift back to slavery, and what we know about slavery here in 2024 is very, very different than the kind of slavery they had in the Bible. First of all, if a man was a slave, he was only a slave for a set period of years, usually about 7 years. And then at that 7-year period, he was given a choice. You can choose to stay with this master, or you can leave and be free. And that was his choice. And if you had a wife and kids before you were a slave to this man, then they came with you. Your families were not separated. Also, you couldn't treat a slave however you wanted to. They were considered people just like everybody else. That was what made slavery so horrible in America. They weren't considered people. They were considered cattle, like every other, farming animal out there, like the ox or whatever, and that's how they were treated. And though the law said you couldn't murder anybody, slaves didn't count because they were just slaves. They're not people. It's a horrible attitude to have about it. And that was why it was so terrible. That's not what the Bible does when it talks about slavery. There are very strict rules about how they were allowed to treat their slaves, how long they were allowed to be a slave, and all of these things. So he's going to sell the man into slavery to pay back the debt. However much he gets for this man and his family is going to go toward paying that debt off. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will repay thee all. So he's sorrowful, he's begging, he's upset, he's scared. He does not want to be sold like this. He does not want his family to have to suffer because of his bad choices. But can I remind you this morning that your bad choices don't just affect you? Yeah. When you make a poor choice, it affects everybody in your circle. All the people that work for you, all the people in your family, all of your friends, they're all affected by the bad choices that we make. And so he's begging his master not to make his family pay for his bad mistake. And in verse 27, it says, Then the Lord of the servant was moved with compassion and loosed him and forgave the debt. He forgave the debt. And let me tell you, this is not a man who's a reputable man, this servant. He's not one that you could trust to pay back, even though he promised that he was going to pay it back. He's coming to his master. He's saying, please, you give me a little time. I swear I'll pay the whole thing. I promise I will. I'll pay off the whole debt. Just give me a little time. And there was no guarantee that that was going to happen. As a matter of fact, there's no guarantee that that servant wasn't going to do anything other than take off and run with his family and go into hiding. So the master, knowing this, just forgives the debt. That's the only smart thing you can do. You know, if you go to a bank and you want to ask for a loan from that bank has got to know that you're a good investment, or they're not going to give you a dime. They've got to look at your credit score. They're going to look at your history with on-time payments. They're going to look at all of these things and then decide whether or not they can trust you with their money and then pay back the debt. And it's the same way here. There's no reason to trust that this servant was going to keep his word. So the master just forgave it. And the analogy here, because remember, this is a parable that Jesus is telling his disciples. These aren't real people. The analogy here is God and us. Now, how many times have you heard your kids say, or kids say to their parents, I promise, please, don't take it away, don't spank me, don't punish me, I promise I'll never do it again. How many heard that before? I've heard it before. How many maybe said that when you were a kid? I promise I'll never do it again. I had a lot more hands on that one. There's an honest crowd right there. I promise I'll never do it again. And isn't that sometimes what people do with God? Sometimes people say, oh, God, you give me this promotion. Oh, God, you give me this thing that I want, and I promise I'll never do these things again. Or sometimes they'll say, I promise I'll go to church every Sunday. I'll never miss a Sunday. They'll make these deals with God, and God knows these people. And he knows, I can't trust you to keep your word. We're flawed human beings, aren't we? Yes. We're going to mess up. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have a hard time keeping our end of the bargain. That's where covenants come in. Covenants, how many have heard of covenants before? Okay. How many know what a covenant is? Okay. A covenant, for those of you who don't know, is a special kind of deal that you make between two parties. There's an actual ritual that is to be done when it's a biblical covenant. There are animals that are meant to be sacrificed. They're meant to be one part over here, one part over there. You walk between, and both parties have their own parts that they're meant to do. You can actually read in the book of Genesis where Abraham performed this covenant ritual. And he performed it with God. And it's actually extremely interesting to study if you're into that kind of thing.
What chapter?
For the Abraham thing, I'll have to look it up afterwards. I've got an article about it somewhere in my notes or in my files. But the interesting thing about it is, I actually heard a pastor by the name of Johnny Pope teaching on that too. It's really fascinating. But the interesting thing about it is that when you look at the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, it is a covenant promise being made there. That Jesus is both the sacrifice and the sacrificer, with God the Father being the other part of that covenant. He's representing all of mankind as the one making the offering, but he also represents the sacrifice as well. So God said, I can't trust you to keep your end of the bargain. And Jesus said, you know what? I'll pay it for him. He said, you know what? They can't pay it. Right? I know they're promising they can. They're going to try to. They can't. We all know they can't. I'll take care of it for them. That's what this master was doing. That's what God did for us. He said, you know what? I know you can't pay this debt. I'm just going to forgive it. I'll just forgive the whole debt, wipe the whole thing clean. So then the same servant, after this incredible forgiveness, in verse 28, went out and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence. Now, this man owed 10,000 talents, remember. Now, Jesus is saying that his fellow servant that he went out and found owes 100 pence. A pence is worth less than a talent. So keep that in mind. So 100 pence is a lot less money than 10,000 talents. It's the point it's really wanting you to grab this morning. Right? So he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, "Pay me that thou owest." And his fellow servant fell down at his feet and besought him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all." Where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
Right? And his fellow servant fell down at his feet and besought him, saying, or "Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all." And verse 30 says, "And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt." So, this isn't, again, a real story. These aren't real people, but it's a story Jesus is telling about things that do happen. Right? That's why they're so relatable, because we know these things happen. They happen sometimes in life. Sometimes they happen in the real world, in the business world. And how do you suppose people in the real world justify their behavior in this way? They say, well, that master, he can afford to forgive that kind of debt. He's a very wealthy man. He's got a lot of money. He can afford to not have that money. I can't afford that. If he doesn't pay me back, it's a lot bigger deal for me than it is for him. So he justifies his cruelty in that way. He might also say something like, well, if I let him just forgive the debt completely, he's never going to learn a lesson. If there are no consequences to his actions, he's never going to learn to pay the debt back. And these are excuses that this man might have used to justify his cruelty. And how do we know that? We know that because it's what people do today. We want a candidate voted for that's going to hold people's feet to the fire. Why? What is Jesus talking about here? Forgiveness. Right? And what do we say about people looking, for money, that they're begging for money on the sides of the roads and so forth? We say, I couldn't give them any money. They're not going to learn anything. Jesus is teaching forgiveness. Forgiveness comes in all kinds of shapes and forms. It can be a debt that's forgiven, like Jesus is talking about. It can be a forgiveness in like a relationship between family, between a friendship. Forgiveness can come in all kinds of different directions. And what we see Jesus talking about here is us receiving forgiveness. We receive forgiveness from other people. How many people here, I'm not going to ask for details or anything, so don't worry about it, but I'm going to raise my hand on this one. How many people here have ever had a debt forgiven? I have. Yeah, just about everybody has. It's a wonderful feeling. How often when somebody owes you money, do you remember that? Right? But I can tell you this for certain, you owed a debt to God. Because everybody does. We all owe a debt to God. And that debt was forgiven completely. I didn't deserve that. None of us deserve that. And yet when somebody does something wrong to us in life, how often is it our tendency to say, no, I'm done. No, that's too much. I'm done. And Jesus says it's never too much. It's never too much. Because look at verse 31. It says, when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry. Imagine being one of those people that works in that place with that master. And you've seen this beautiful story. They're probably telling everybody they know about, man, it was such a beautiful day at work today. This guy, he owed 10,000 talents to the master, and probably their friends and family going, how on earth did he get so under the eight ball on that one? I don't know. It's not really into my business, but he was down bad. And the master was going to sell him off, but he got so sad and so scared. That master, he saw him, he felt bad for him, and he just said, you know what? Let's pretend like the 10,000 talents don't even exist. What? Are you serious? Yeah, man, you got a good master. You got a good boss. You better stick to that job. Oh, I'm going to. He's a good man for sure. And then you come back to work to find out that man who had been forgiven grabbed one of your fellow workers by the throat and cast him into prison. Well, that puts a bad taste on the end of a good story, doesn't it? And they came and told their Lord all that was done. They said, Master, we got to tell you something. I don't mean to cause trouble. I don't mean to be a snitch or anything, but I just saw him do A, B, and C, and now the master knows. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant. Now let me ask you another question this morning, folks. Do you think he considered himself to be a wicked servant? No, of course not. Yeah, exactly. He didn't think of himself as a wicked servant. He thought he was doing what he had to. He thought he was doing what was best. So his master comes to him and calls him a wicked servant. There's all kinds of ways to react to that. But how many times do we consider ourselves to be a wicked servant? We don't. And that's the answer. We don't think of ourselves as wicked, or we wouldn't behave the way that we do. But there are times where our actions are wicked. You know when those moments are? When we're selfish. When our actions are only for us. When the only person that we are interested in benefiting is ourselves. That's when we become wicked. We don't consider it wicked, but it is. Thou wicked servant, he calls him. I forgave thee all that debt because thou desiredst me. All you had to do was ask me, and I forgave you. Shouldest thou not also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? So here's the crux of the lesson this morning, folks. He said, remember the Lord's Prayer, the model prayer? Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray. They said, Lord, teach us to pray. He says, after this manner, therefore, pray ye. Here's an example of a prayer that you can use to model after. He says, Our Father which art in heaven. Anybody know this one? Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, trespasses. Yeah, it's in there. Different books, same concept. As we forgive our debtors or those who trespassed against us. Right there in the model prayer. Forgive us as we forgive. That's not in reference to salvation. That doesn't mean if you harbor bitterness, you're going to lose your salvation. It's relationally between you and God. It means if you're going to harbor bitterness, God's going to treat you in likewise. Right? He's going to treat you in kind the way you treat other people. Any of your brothers and sisters in Christ, you might say, you don't know the kind of person they are. You don't know what they did to me. It does not matter. Did they put you on a Roman cross? Were you whipped with a cat of nine tails? Were you bloodied and bludgeoned and beaten and battered and bruised? Jesus Christ suffered on that cross in a way that no human being can ever comprehend because his pain was more than mortal. It was supernatural. His pain was divine. He was schismed. He was severed from God the Son was schismed and severed from God the Father in a way that should not be feasibly possible were it not for our sin. Whatever they did, you did worse. He says his Lord was wroth and delivered him to the tormentors till he should pay all that was due unto him. So twice we see these guys thrown into prison until the debt was paid. And if you are thinking about our prisons here in America, you might think, how on earth does that pay off a debt? It's not the same thing. Okay. In their prisons, they would go and they would work in the prisons like you would work a job. So they're in prison, but during the day, they're working a job. And all that money, instead of going to the prisoner or going to the state or whatever it does, that money that they earn during the day goes to the person that they owed a debt to. And they're released from prison when the debt is paid in full. And it's not a large sum. You know, they didn't exactly have a minimum wage there in Roman days. He says in verse 35, So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, If ye from your hearts forgive not everyone his brother their trespasses. If we harbor anger, bitterness, wrath, and hate, if we refuse to forgive those that want to be forgiven, then God is going to treat us the way that we treat them. The Christian creed is compassion. It's forgiveness. It's helping somebody entirely. Sure, you can teach a man to fish, but if he's starving to death, that's not going to help him today. Why don't we give a man a fish and then also teach a man to fish? Why don't we do that? So many times we excuse our greed in these different ways, but Christ would have us have compassion and forgiveness. How many times did he tell the rich people he met to sell all that they have and give to the poor? Give it away. Just for free. Because there are people that are down on their luck. And those of us that have a little extra should do something to make their lives a little less hard. They say, well, what if it's their fault? Well, what if they're addicted to drugs? Well, what if they're, an alcoholic? I'm not the great judge. If they do wrong with the help that they've been offered, if I give them help and they use it in the wrong way, they answer to God for that. But if I don't help them because I think they might use it in the wrong way, I answer to God for that. Let's have some forgiveness. Let's have some compassion. And let's learn to treat people the way that Jesus would treat them. Well, that is our lesson for this morning. We're out a bit early. Yeah. Yeah, so I can forgive somebody. Right? If they come to me, I'm sorry, I forgive you. I'm not angry at them. I'm not harboring any ill will toward them. But if he was running a backhoe drunk on the job the day before and that's what I'm forgiving, I'm still probably not going to put him back on that backhoe. You know what I mean? So it's like if somebody, got mad and hit me or was, mean to my family in some way, I can forgive that. But I might be weary about letting my family around him again. That kind of a thing. So it's just a matter of trusting somebody with whatever it was until they've proven they can be trusted again. Doesn't mean you're still mad at them. Doesn't mean you don't forgive them. It just means you're going to be careful about whatever that thing was. A matter of wisdom. Like if a man is, just got out of jail for robbing a bank, probably not smart to give him a job as a teller. That kind of a thing. And forgiveness. Yep. And having bitterness. Bitterness. Yeah. So bitterness is about me. Forgiveness is about both of us. Right? So he comes to me and asks for forgiveness, and then I forgive him. Right? Yeah. That's what that was. Yes, ma'am. Some people, and I'll tell you this psychologically, because I have taken some psychology classes, almost nobody's going to come up to you and say, please forgive me. They're going to do it in their own way. If they just apologize, they say, I'm sorry. That's usually their way of asking for forgiveness. Some people struggle with that word sorry. They'll be like, hey, I made you a pie. That's their way of, whatever, some action they do because they want to be friends again. And that's how they're asking for forgiveness. So in those moments, yeah, it's important to forgive them and learn to forgive them. If they don't come to you at all, right, it's important not to hold that bitterness in your heart, but that's about you, right? You're still not going to have that relationship because that thing is still in the way, but you shouldn't harbor that anger and that bitterness in your heart. And if they come to you and ask for forgiveness, then you forgive them. Does that make sense? Okay. I am going to try to find that chapter for you. I'll get back to you. But yeah, that's our lesson. So